Hello, everybody, and welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Liz Owen. I'm the Director of Communications at PFLAG National. It's so great to have you here. We are going to have a fantastic discussion today. I know it. Now I'm going to bring in my good friend and colleague who, when you see how fabulous she looks, you will understand why I always feel completely underdressed. Jean Marie Nevada.
Liz Owen, thank you.
That's right.
Wow. You really set me up. I want to point out I got my bangs cut, so my mom isn't upset this week. So
nothing going on here. I will leave you with that comment.
I will see you back in a few minutes. So welcome everybody to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Jean Marie Nevada. I'm the Director of Learning and Inclusion at PFLAG National. Every week we get together to talk about an article, about something going on that's worth the conversation. And we definitely want you to be part of our conversation and maybe even have the conversation at home yourself. So before we get started, what I want you to do is check out straightforequality.org/discussion series. And what you'll be able to do is access all of the articles that we have used, including this week's article, along with the discussion questions that we've created for you. So this week's article is a super fascinating one, and I am so excited to have my colleagues at work with me because we have been chatting about this quite a bit. This week we are talking about why should queer performers play queer roles, the authenticity of experience. And this interesting article appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle Datebook. It was written by Tony Bravo. And essentially the article is in films and in television. Should we exclusively have queer actors playing queer roles, or is it acceptable for straight and cisgender actors to join in? And so we wanted to have a really fun conversation today, a kind of merging of the queer and ally minds. And so to start the conversation, I want to bring in two of my very favorite colleagues, Jamel Dooley and Jamie Henkel. Hello, Jamel. Welcome back. Hello, Henkel.
Hello.
So we are really excited about this article. And Liz, for everybody who is participating with us online, Liz is going to be in the chat with you for about the first maybe 5-10 minutes of today's conversation. And then she's going to come over and join in because she has some great background in this too. And so I really want to get into this article in which I am fully expecting disagreement and controversy. I'm trying to cultivate controversy for us because why not? It's Thursday. So it's Thursday, we think, in the year 2000. So, my friends, let's begin with our first question, which is, after reading the article, do you believe that the author's assertion that LGBTQ characters in TV and film should be portrayed by actors who have lived these experiences? So why or why not? And I'm actually going to ask Jamel to talk first, and then Henkel, I'm going to look to you.
Thank you. So as we figured out, this is a multi-tier and very in-depth conversational piece. The first thing that came up to me was representation and opportunity. I think there is something to be said to see an LGBTQ plus person on the small or the big screen portraying or giving life to LGBTQ experiences. I remember some of the first times that I saw myself reflected in LGBT media, and it felt amazing. And so I feel like that opportunity has to continue to arise for others. But the other thing is opportunity to get roles. Many LGBTQ folks are shut out of opportunities to get roles for straight characters. And so what does it mean if they're also not able to play LGBT characters? So it feels weird to allow the straight or cis folks to have all of the opportunities and then the LGBTQ folks to have this smaller pool of opportunities, if that makes sense.
Oh, it makes perfect sense. And I think it sort of raises the question about, is this just about the visibility, or is this about sort of creating this pipeline for talent to become engaged in different kinds of ways, and who gets excluded, who gets included? Jamie, talk to us a little bit about your perspective.
Yeah, I agree with literally everything Jamel just said. And I think that there is definitely validity to the argument that the author of this particular article was making. And I truly and honestly believe that like queer folks should be involved in television and film in every single part of the process, not just on the screen, but as writers, as camera people, as makeup people, as directors, as producers. Like, I think that queer people should be involved in all parts of the process. But there is a very small part of me that calls BS on this. Because I think that it puts you in dangerous territory, right? It puts you in a position where you're saying, well, if straight actors can't play queer characters, does that mean that queer actors can only play queer characters?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to be in that position. I don't want to be in that world. And I also think it puts us in dangerous territory because we've had a couple of examples recently where young, up-and-coming, specifically actresses, have very publicly come out and say that they essentially felt shamed into coming out because they were involved in a project that was deemed to be queer, and they are perceived to be straight and cisgender. And like they, when they didn't feel safe, when they didn't want to, when they weren't ready for it, they sort of felt forced to come out. And I don't want to be in that world either. And an example that comes to mind for me is Jamila Jamil, who was on The Good Place and is an up-and-coming actress, is a huge presence on social media, was going to be involved as a judge on this upcoming series about ballroom culture and was called out as being not a queer person involved in this very queer thing. And she had to publicly come out and say, I've never lied about the fact that I'm queer. I feel like I'm public about it in my personal life, but in my public life, my public persona, it's dangerous for me. I'm someone of South Asian descent. It's not something that is always going to be safe for me, but in this moment, I feel like I have to because I'm being so like I don't want to live in that world either.
Yeah, I think that it calls in some really interesting. Sometimes conflicting ideas that we want everybody to have the possibility to play anyone who they want, because I mean that sort of is at the heart of acting, and that you're embodying characters who you are not. I mean, not everyone who plays Lady Macbeth is a murderous psychopath, for example, but we embody her when we play Lady Macbeth for that time. And yet I think there is such a case for how queer actors, particularly out ones, have been shut out. And as we get into more marginalized spaces, so queer actors who are also, for example, African American, who are Latinx, it becomes even more challenging. But I think, Henkel, you make some really interesting points about we could inadvertently force people out in order to justify their participation in queer projects, which is a really scary sort of underbelly that I don't think a lot of people pay attention to. And honestly, I actually hadn't even noticed that. And Jamie and I were talking, and she pointed out that one of my favorite actresses from Riverdale, because I'm actually a 16-year-old girl, this happened to her too. I'm wondering, I know that we have a lot of conversation going on in the chat, but I definitely want to see if Liz wants to come back in with us so we can get into this second part of the question. Hello, Liz.
I am chomping at the bit over here.
I'm dying back there. So I actually want to get into the second part of the question, because I think this is a really fascinating one. And it made me think about movies I've seen and what I read as queer and what I don't read as queer and how we read that. And so the question for us is, as a viewer, do you feel like you're able to clock straight actors playing queer characters and spot affected gayness? So where it absolutely doesn't feel or look authentic. And how do you feel about this concept? I'm actually going to ask Liz if she can talk about it first, and then we'll go around one more time.
Sure. So I think this is a really layered question, because I think the more people, right, it's coming out month, right? Coming out day is coming up. It's LGBTQ History Month. And the more people start to have experiences in their own lives with people who they know are LGBTQ+, I think the more we see them on screen and say, what does that mean to spot gayness, to spot transness? And I will quickly raise this, for those who haven't seen Disclosure on Netflix, Jen Richards, who's a wonderful trans writer, producer, actor, talks about this, you know, that when she plays a role, she doesn't have to affect transness. Just by virtue of being herself, embodying a role, she shows up, and there it is. So I think there are a lot of layers to this question.
Yeah, I definitely think that there are. Jamel, talk to me.
Absolutely. I feel that I can usually clock actual LGBT folks. It's just you can tell when someone is coming from just a place of authenticity and experience, and they connect with that material. But also, like, there's some obvious examples of straight or cis actors that do a pretty good job at portraying, you know, gay characters on TV. I think about Michael K. Williams and his character on Oz and Lovecraft Country. I think about Christopher Maloney. Like, these are people that have these lives and these careers where they've played a lot of gay characters, but they are straight men. Yeah, like it's a both and not a either or for me. The other important thing though is like we don't want to stereotype what it means to be gay or what it means to be trans. And so I do think it's a double bind. It's like we're watching them on these programs and you're looking for signaling or things that might reveal that they're family, so to speak. But is that not also stereotyping? Like you have this like preconceived notion of what it means to be gay or what it means to be trans, and you're looking for those characteristics, and that also feels very like weird and not quite
like a book, like this is how lesbians talk, or this is how lesbians walk. Or, if somebody gets the book, if you can send it to me, because I haven't figured that part out yet. Jamie, talk to me about this.
So I am a person who today in 2020, I absolutely cannot clock if there are straight actors playing queer characters, or if there are queer actors playing straight. Like I can't do it. And I think that is probably a really good thing, because if you ask me the same question 10 years ago or nearly 20 years ago, when the film that the author of this article specifically calls out came out, I probably could have clocked. And the things that they called out in the article, like, I'm like, yeah, I remember that. I saw that. I get where they're coming from. But in 2020, I absolutely can't. And the example that I shared with you all, and that folks that watch Something to Talk About Live have heard me talk about before, on the show Sense8, there is a gay couple, Lido and his partner, and they are from Mexico. And I remember doing some like Googling at some point to see, I think if they were actually in a relationship, because they were just so passionate together. And they're both straight men. And so like, I can't do it. I'm not a person who can clock it.
I think it's so fascinating, because I think we all sort of got to the same thing, that the only thing that we have to go on is actually stereotypes of stuff, because there's no specific way to be gay. There's no specific way to be lesbian. There's no specific way to be trans. And I was trying to think of examples of where it absolutely didn't work, and where when I watched it, I just remember having the horrible cringe. And I have to admit, what came into my mind was Jennifer Lopez playing a lesbian hit woman was Jilly or something. And it is absolutely one of the most catastrophic things. I mean, it's just a catastrophically bad film.
I was going to say, you just put that movie back in everybody's mind.
Oh my gosh. But the ways they chose to like sort of demonstrate her gayness, I mean, of course, short of having sex with another woman for a man's pleasure, was so thoroughly ridiculous. And yet I think of lots of films where we were either willing to suspend disbelief. I give you Brokeback Mountain. Or we were willing to suspend disbelief long enough to acknowledge this was important. If we had our way, it would have looked a little different. And I think that's interesting.
And it has changed over the years. I was watching the film Soldier's Girl the other day with Lee Pace, right? Which was almost 20 years ago now. Lee Pace, who plays a fantastic bisexual lead character in Halt and Catch Fire. If you haven't seen it, watch it. 20 years ago, when he portrayed Calpurnia Adams, at the time I was like, who is this woman? And then discovered it wasn't. Now I would cringe. Not that he wasn't good, but there are too many wonderful trans actresses for me to be even okay with what that looks like now.
And I agree with that. And I think I've got to say, the way that Pose has brought this conversation into a very mainstream place when it comes to trans women of color, I am so grateful, even where I've disagreed with what people sort of put out there. It has made this conversation so real, and it has proven that it's not for lack of people out there to play the roles or to staff the shows or to be the creatives behind the scenes, to the points that were made earlier, but it's really, really transformed things. So I want to talk a little bit about impact. So Jamel, when we first started, you said right away, you're like, visibility is important. Representation is important. I think none of us would disagree with that. So I want to talk about our last question. And I think this is an interesting one because we have our interesting queer/ally panel. I see, Liz, you put us on either side of the screen for this one.
That was unintentional. I have no control over what.
It's like the Hollywood squares of queerness and allyship here.
There you go.
Okay. Of our screen. So I want to talk a little bit about what do you think the impact is on both sides of this? So what do you think the impact is of actors who are not members of the LGBTQ space playing roles that are in that space? And what do we think is the impact when it actually is queer actors playing these roles? And this time I'm actually going to turn the order around. And Henkel, maybe can we start with you on this one?
Yeah, so this is another place where I think the historical context is really significant, because the way I would have answered this question 10 years ago or 20 years ago is significantly different than the way I answer it now. Like in my adult life, since I, let's say, graduated from college in 2007, we have gone from a time where we applauded and celebrated and uplifted straight actors who are willing to play queer characters because they were told for so long that it would be a career ender. You know, we were in a time where that was something that we celebrated, and now where this conversation has shifted, and I think in a very, very important way. But I have to imagine that if we were having this conversation 10 or 15 years ago, that the impact of seeing a straight cis actor play a queer character, let's say in a film like Philadelphia, would be really powerful and moving, and like it brought our issues to the forefront. And if Tom Hanks hadn't taken on that role, we'd be having it like, and so that's really what strikes me about this. And I think that as we're having this conversation now, it's just so much more nuanced, and it is about finding the right fit and finding somebody who has empathy with the character and what have you. And I don't think that I have much that is of value to say about sort of how seeing queer actors in queer roles might affect somebody who's LGBTQ, because it's not an experience that I've had. But for me, it's really uplifting to see that validation and to see people getting screen time and being involved in projects that they clearly are very passionate about.
Jamel.
I really think it's a thin line. I agree with Jamie Hinkle. Like, if someone that is straight or cis is going to be in a gay role, like, you just have to treat it with care. And like we've seen examples of people that have done it with care and people that have not, and so that kind of gives me pause. My fear is that like people that may not be familiar with this knowledge of this topic will think, oh well, such and such portrayed a gay person, that means gay people can act straight. And it's like, well, that's not exactly like how this works. And we can talk about the myriad of things that are problematic about that. So that's a consideration. My other consideration was, I think there's a certain level of like empowerment and love and just like shared achievement that you see, like, or that you feel when there's an LGBTQ person that gets out there and they have range and they win the award and they show us that they can like really, really act. And, you know, they're playing the straight roles and they do a great job. Like, it's a different feeling and it kind of has a different impact on me. Mm-hmm. So it's once, like you just said, like it's just nuanced. It's very nuanced.
Liz, impact.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. My brain went where Jamie Henkel's brain went first, which was, I mean, you know, that whole idea that, you know, not even 10 years ago, or even more recently with trans characters, that it was so brave to do that. You know, the way it was brave for like Charlize Theron to put on 30 pounds for a part. Like, that's not actually brave.
30 pounds all the time.
Exactly. I am so brave. You know, that there was a certain like heroism to doing that, where so I was reading another article today, this one in Out, about an interview with Charlie Carver, who is starring now, right, is it The Boys in the Band that just came out this week, and talking about he was being pressured to not act as gay in his real life, because it would inhibit his ability to get parts. And so as the conversation has evolved, evolved now, where there are more and more LGBTQ folks playing roles, there are more people who are out in other parts. Like I think about Joey Soloway, who made sure once, they did their first year of Transparent, really shifted everything about their crew and their creative staff, and even went so far as to kill off a character to honor all of the many things that were going on camera and off camera. That I think this conversation will keep shifting, and to bring it all the way back to the beginning again, the more opportunity we have for LGBTQ plus to play parts, the more that playing field is leveled, then we can start talking about, well, okay, well now everybody can play every part, so let's even it out, and it's really based on who's best for the role. But until the opportunity is there for everybody, I think it's really still problematic to have non-queer people, particularly non-trans people, having cisgender people playing trans roles, to me, and non-binary roles, to me, is super problematic, because there's so little opportunity. So why would you take away even more opportunity from someone doing that?
One thing that I wanted to add, because I was scrolling through the chat and breaking the rules a little bit, but a couple of people I think have called out and noticed that this is a different conversation depending on the story that's being told, right? Like if it is a story about somebody's coming out experience, if it is a story about that's centered around their queerness, it is a different conversation than if being queer is just like one part of a character in a larger story. And so I wanted to throw that out there as well, because I did see it scroll past a few times.
It really talks about the evolution and the importance of story. Like when you bring a queer character to a story, does the story have to be about queerness or evolution of a queer person? Or can it be a queer person in a story where a queerness is just a piece of who they are, and it's part of does every story have to be coming out and how after hours PFLAG word and how bad it is? And I think that's also a really problematic part of this.
And I think one of the things that all of us have hit on is that no one's willing to make it's all this or it's all that there are kind of degrees of this, and we're all looking at what the content is. And what I'm hearing, at least, and maybe this is just me putting my imprint on it, but I mean, particularly in the trans space, because this is the place where I think we are having the most conversation right now. And I think especially because so many trans actors have in fact been shut out of things and marginalized. And yet understanding that sometimes it is because it has been mainstream, not LGBTQ actors, that things have gotten off the ground, that we've actually, Philadelphia was a mainstream film because it starred Tom Hanks and Denzel Washington, and not two queer actors who at that point in the 90s probably wouldn't have done that. Liz and I were earlier talking about Trans America, which there are a whole host of things we can say about it. But there's a reason it got so much attention in a mainstream, and was not relegated to an LGBTQ film festival only. And it was because it had mainstream big actors who are in jail now.
And yet the stories that I used to be in entertainment publicity, and I remember that a lot of the publicity that was being built around that story was how that actor worked to have a trans sounding voice, which, you built a whole kind of little bit of a mini campaign around that, but now I don't think they would ever be allowed to get away with that. And if they did, you could bet that we would all be clapping back against how horrible.
What is the trans sounding voice?
What is a trans voice?
I think I'm a little angrier about all of this.
Yeah,
I think I'm a little angry about all of this than I thought I was when we first started this conversation.
Anger there. I actually do see we have a question in the chat that I wanted to raise, which was, how do you think we can think and move beyond the feminism of being LGBT, trying to play in the mainstream space? So
I'm going to take you out and bring you back in because we're having some sound. Hang on one second. Let's try you again.
Do I exist now?
Yes, you're good.
I exist in a single voice. So the question was, how do you think we can think and move beyond the tokenism of being LGBTQ plus folks trying to play any role in a mainstream space?
I think there just have to be, I don't know if it's that and I mean LGBTQ people, like, is it that we need to create the opportunities, or do those that have like the power need to make the opportunities? But my statement was going to be that I think there need to be more legit, like well-made opportunities for LGBTQ plus folks. Like, I'm tired of seeing the gay best friend. I'm tired of seeing the straight male comedian in a dress and a wig. Like, those are the type of like roles. Like, does it give something? Sure. But I think in the long run, it's kind of damaging. Many of the LGBT folks that do get these opportunities have smaller roles. They're in the background, or it's a comedic performance and that launches them and gives them opportunity to do other things. And I think that's extremely problematic. So the answer, like, there just need to be more opportunities.
Yeah, because it sometimes feels like they're there just to be the queer character. Like, how do we get beyond being there because you're queer, but because you have something else that is functional in this story?
Yeah, well, and I would say, I think that is why I want to see more stories where, and maybe this is in contradiction to that, I want to see more stories where queerness is not the only thing that person is. Like, that's not the story for them. Like, this is a really, really goofy example, and it was sort of a throwaway, but I watched this Disney Plus movie about second-born royals or something, and like a teacher comes into the room, says, "This is my name, this is my boyfriend's name, we have a dog," and like that was it. His queerness was not the story. But it was and I want to see more of that. I don't want it to be the only thing that we see. I want it to be a both and. But I feel like as we see more of those examples where the queerness is not the only thing that person is, the less of this tokenism we're gonna have or feel or experience.
I do need to mention that somebody in the chat has mentioned the Hallmark movie that is coming up, which is going to feature not just a gay storyline, but actors who in fact are gay themselves, and they are in fact a couple. So we're actually seeing sort of this real life sort of confluence right now.
So we got a comment here from Leticia, and I think it goes to the point that we were just talking about that we're demanding more nuanced stories. Yeah. And I remember, quite honestly, I hated the movie Philadelphia. And the reason I hated it is because everyone who was bad was just bad, and everyone who was good was just good. And there was no gray area in that story at all. It was just bad people hating people with AIDS who are gay, and good people who are just good in everything they do. And again, this was so long ago at a time when we just wanted to get stories on screen. But I think now we are looking to tell more nuanced stories. I don't know that we always do it well, but I feel like there are at least more people trying. And it goes back to the point Jamie made at the beginning, which is if you have queer people in the room where the stories are being written and who are greenlighting these projects, then the stories are going to be told.
Do we need like a Bechdel test for like queerness in films now? Like, can queer actors exist in scenes where they're not only talking about their queerness or someone else's queer? I mean, like, I wonder if we actually need to start looking at it that way, to start evaluating, have we gotten beyond just talking about a single identity that someone has? So I'm going to ask everybody this. Because we didn't plan on this one. I'm going to ask everybody, because I love doing one question.
We're going to run a little long today, but I think if everybody can hang out for a couple of extra minutes, I think it'll be worth it.
I'm interested to know one film, whether it had queer actors or straight actors, that falls sort of into this genre that we're talking about, that really had an impression on you, like that first time that you saw queer on screen and you were just like, wow.
I remember mine popped.
Go.
So it's probably going to fall into that stereotype lane, but I grew up in New York City, in Manhattan, in the 80s and 90s, and my teenage years were spent singing in gay bars. I was a fat teenager with a loud singing voice, and that's where I found my people. So the movie Parting Glances was it's still one of my absolute favorite movies, but for me, it did not feel like Stereotype, because that was my family. That was my chosen family. And when I saw them on screen, Steve Buscemi, who just, I mean, that whole movie, like I just got goosebumps talking about it again. I loved that movie because it felt like home when I watched it.
It really is. Henko, we're officially on speed round.
So this is gonna sound bad, but I think for me, the one that like really comes to mind is The Birdcage. Because it was a film that, because my mom loved it, it was something I watched at a very young age, and it was something that she used to help me relate to the gay. Like, anyway, it just stands out to me as like, that's the first movie as a very young child. I remember being like, oh, okay, they're in love with each other, like my mom and okay, cool.
There it is.
Out to me.
Jamel.
So I think the first time that I saw myself reflected in the media, I was in college, and it was Noah's Ark with and I could see aspects of myself in each of the characters. They're all Black and navigating the highways and byways of being 20-something plus through 30. The first time I saw myself in film, I think, was actually Moonlight, and I really enjoyed just the depth of the story. This gay Black man in a predominantly Black community trying to navigate his identity. Like, it just got me thinking about childhood and you. Like, it just put me in a good space to just think.
Yeah. I have to say there are two. The one that I remember just as a very young person is Longtime Companion, which came out. Yeah. It is an agonizing film to watch. It's still a beautiful film. It was very much of the time it is about AIDS. But I have to say, the first time I actually, when we talk about seeing yourself, it was an HBO movie. It was If These Walls Could Talk too, because it actually included a storyline about butch femme identities. And it was the first time I had ever seen it in any way that didn't feel theatrical, overly theatrical, in sort of as part of the story. And I just remember looking and thinking, I can't believe I'm watching this. It's the most amazing thing. We are at time. We're a little bit over time. We usually keep ourselves at 30 minutes, but it was too good. See, we do need the after hours. So, my friends, thank you. This is like the best 30 minutes of my week. I'm serious. Liz, Jamel, Jamie, thank you so much. And everybody who joins us every single week, thank you so, so much. We wrap up the exact same way every single week, which is we remind you to run fast, laugh hard, and to be kind. And above all else, continue wearing your mask. Mine matches my dress, of course. We are really looking forward to seeing you again next week. Please keep these conversations going at home. Talk to somebody who you've never had a conversation with about this and get the discussion going. My name is Jean Marie Nevada. I'm Director of Learning Inclusion at PFLAG. You can learn more about us at pflag.org. We'll see you again next week on Something to Talk About.